Hello, everyone, and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace, FMEP. I am Hilary Rantisi, a 2025 Fellow at FMEP. Today is September 29, 2025, and I am honored to be in conversation with Mouin Rabbani. Mouin is a friend. He's also an independent analyst, commentator, and researcher specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. Mouin has a rich history of work, including in the UN and many other organizations, such as the International Crisis Group. Too many to list here, but we are attaching his bio to this podcast. He's currently a co-editor of Al Jadaliya, where he also has podcasts, and you can hear his analysis on a regular basis as well as read it. So thank you so much, Mouin, for joining today.
Thank you very much, Hilary. And the honor is all mine.
Oh, thank you. And there is just so much to be in conversation about. And what we talked about covering, it continues to shift because it feels like so much is happening on a daily basis, if not hourly basis. And I thought maybe we could start with the latest news coming from the White House just, minutes ago after Trump and Netanyahu met today. And maybe you could give us your take on the talk of a ceasefire and the 20-point plan, no longer 21-point plan, for Gaza post
Right.
ceasefire. So what can you blame from at least what has been shared and
Yeah.
from the press
Yeah. I mean,
conference?
that's of course the key development, and as you noted, we're speaking literally minutes after the conclusion of the Trump Netanyahu press conference at the White House, and it raises a large number of questions. My impression had been that during the recent meeting held between Trump and the delegation of Arab leaders and leaders of Muslim states, that there had basically been an informal agreement that they had agreed on a
Mhm.
21-point plan, and that Trump had committed to bringing Israel on board, and the Arab and Muslim leaders had committed to ensuring Hamas's agreement to the 21-point plan. Now, today, we have a 20-point plan, and
Yeah.
what we don't know is, was this point removed at Netanyahu's insistence without the knowledge or consent of the Arab and Muslim states? Um, uh, all kinds of questions about what has happened in the intervening days. So, for example, if you listen to the press conference, the vibes that came out of that are quite different from the actual text of the agreement.
Right.
For example, the agreement includes the terms Palestinian self determination and
Mhm.
potentially a Palestinian state, something both Trump and Netanyahu, who were really indistinguishable in their statements, spoke quite openly against. Have there been other amendments that have not yet been cleared with the Arab Muslim group
So,
that Trump met
so
with?
from what you can tell, the actual 20 20-point plan that has been released to the media, how closely does that align from what you can see briefly, because you've just had a chance to look at it, with what was agreed with the Arab and Muslim countries?
I can't really answer that question
Yeah,
because I didn't see the full text of the
yeah.
21-point plan, and I haven't been able to compare it with today's 20-point plan. I know that a number of Israeli and I believe also British journalists had seen the 21-point plan and had
Hmm.
authenticated it. But there's a broader question about how seriously we should take this entire plan. Is it a case where the real purpose of this entire exercise is to ensure the rapid release of the Israeli captives and the corpses of Israeli captives, because the plan specifies that they need to be released or handed over within 72 hours, and Israel will then either manufacture or provoke Palestinian infraction, and then with the full support of the United States, will basically throw this entire agreement overboard and resume and even intensify its genocide. And there's a lot of missing details
Mm.
in the agreement, or rather in the proposal as well. Uh, Even yesterday, Hamas was saying it hadn't yet been presented with this agreement. And that strengthens my conviction that, in contrast to previous rounds, this is not a negotiation between Hamas and Israel that is being mediated by the Qataris, the Egyptians, and the Americans, but rather consists of an agreement between the Americans and this group of Arab and Muslim states who have each committed to bringing, the Israelis and Hamas on board. But when you look at the entire text, it basically has Oslo written all over it.
Yeah.
Um, Israel has rights, the Palestinians have obligations. Um,
Mm.
if the Palestinians meet a whole series of obligations, and it will be Israel that decides ultimately whether or not the Palestinians have met those obligations, then the Palestinians can make some incremental progress to entirely meaningless objectives like
Yeah.
garbage collection. I was going to add administering the schools, but even that is now in doubt because, of course, the Palestinians all need to be de-radicalized and have to start singing Hatikva at school every morning, and every Palestinian child needs to have a poster of Theodore Herzl and David Ben Gurion in their bedroom to prove that they've been properly de-radicalized. And if and only if A through Z and 1 through infinity have been successfully completed by the Palestinians, then they will not obtain their inalienable right to self
Mm.
determination and statehood. But then a discussion can begin about whether and how they may achieve their inalienable rights. So, once again, exactly as in Oslo, it's best to think of the Palestinians as kind of a hamster in a wheel, and the
Mm.
faster they run, the more they remain in place, and they will never attain anything except the next rung in the wheel, which keeps repeating itself. And it's
Mm.
very, also when you listen if you listen to Trump and Netanyahu, first of all, they were indistinguishable. It's quite clear that the only humans of any value in this entire horrific genocide are the Israeli captives, and even the
Mm.
Israeli corpses have much greater value than any living Palestinian.
Yeah.
And at one point, I think Trump was even talking about how impressive, I think from not just a military, but really from a moral perspective, he found Israel's genocidal military campaign to be. So a lot of
It.
open questions. Has Israel accepted this proposal without reservations? Will Hamas accept it? Will the Arab states accept the agreement as it was published? Or is this perhaps a somewhat different version that hasn't been cleared with them? And most importantly, is it serious to begin with?
Yeah.
Because perhaps its sole purpose is to create the conditions for Hamas to release the military captives it still holds, the corpses of the captives it still holds, and Israel can then resume and intensify the Gaza genocide without any significant domestic opposition. If I could just make one more point, there's
Mm.
also now this, I think, Board of Peace which, as has been pointed out elsewhere today,
The
is
Board of Peace.
yes. So it's this international body chaired, by the world's history's greatest peacemaker,
Trump.
Donald John Trump, and the key person in it will be history's second greatest peacemaker, um, uh,
Tony
Tony
Blair.
Blair, and and it has many of the hallmarks, as was
Mm,
pointed out, of the Coalition Provisional Authority
mm,
that was established in Iraq after the 2003 Anglo-American invasion and occupation. In this case, the green zone will be, I think, in Al Arish in the Sinai Peninsula, rather than in the Gaza Strip. But basically, it will function as kind of a colonial viceroy with
mm.
full control over the Gaza Strip, with full control over its assets and so on. So, you know, I have difficulty taking this proposal seriously
Yeah.
as anything but a maneuver to give Israel what it wants as rapidly as possible so that it doesn't then have to reciprocate with anything.
And perhaps would you say it's a maneuver to obfuscate from all the different recognitions for Palestinian self-determination or statehood by a number of Western countries that hadn't recognized Palestine yet last week. And internally among Palestinians, this whole um, spate of recognitions. I mean, we're very critical that um, most of us see them as symbolic and possibly inconsequential, but maybe others, see them as there's an opening there, or it could be a game changer. And here, just a few days later, we have a whiplash of a completely different conversation with elements of, you throw in the word statehood here and there with no relevance to the rest of the context. But I'm wondering if how does that play in to what we're seeing today, if at all?
Well, I think from Israel's perspective, this is a welcome diversion from the statehood discussion. Yes, the long overdue Western recognitions of Palestinian statehood, and we have to remember that the majority of the international community already recognized the Palestinian state, either immediately after it was proclaimed in November 1988 or long before the turn of the millennium. And now Western states are finally beginning to recognize it. And it is a symbolic measure, and it will remain an exclusively symbolic measure unless concrete actions are taken to make statehood a reality. And this has less to do with what these states do for the Palestinians than how they manage their relations with Israel. If they
Mm,
can continue to supply it with weaponry, if they continue to open their markets to illegal goods from illegal Israeli settlements, if they continue to extend Israel total impunity in its dealings with the Palestinian people, in other words, if they continue to hold Israel to an entirely different standard than every other state they have relations with in terms of allowing it to engage in conduct they wouldn't accept even from their closest allies,
yeah.
then the recognition is absolutely meaningless and arguably does more harm than good. But if it lays the basis for meaningful changes in policy, then it can lead to something. And I'm not sure to what extent there was a conscious connection between what happened today and these recognitions, but quite clearly, when you have successfully placed the Palestinian hamster back into the wheel that remains in place, irrespective of what the Palestinians do, then you've made that entire discussion irrelevant, because the Palestinians have to de-radicalize, demobilize, disarm, reform. They have to do the impossible, and then they have to do it again, and then they have to do it 70 more times, and then we will begin to discuss not statehood and self-determination, but whether they are ready to begin administering their territories on Israel's behalf.
Yes. I mean, and there is mention of some sort of governing body that is envisioned that has, possibly Palestinians at some point, maybe the PA eventually. So again, the Palestinian voices are completely absent from this whole envisioning, but also what this Board of Peace kind of is planning. Um,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, no, it's quite clear to me, at least, that Blair, who was deeply involved
Mm,
at the time in the formation of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, sees that as a model for Gaza, where you have these Palestinians selected by foreign powers to carry out the instruction of these foreign powers and be answerable not to their own people, but to this board. It's a very colonial construct, and of course, we can discuss it. We should discuss it, but in doing so, we also shouldn't lose sight of the very real possibility that none of this is supposed to happen,
mm.
because the real purpose of this proposal is simply to ensure that Israel can retrieve its captives without paying a price as early as possible in this process, and that as soon as it does so, it will find a way to resume and intensify its genocidal campaign. Another explanation is that perhaps the Americans and Tony Blair and Jared Kushner are serious about this plan, but Israel has very different intentions. And if and when Israel throws it overboard and resumes its genocide, it will face, as has been the case for decades, and particularly during the past 2 years, it will face absolutely no consequences, be able to do whatever it wants, however it wants, whenever it wants, wherever it wants, with absolute and total impunity. And of course, we'll have an endless supply of sophisticated Western weaponry and so on to continue slaughtering Palestinian civilians.
So this has been the trajectory, and the hope is that we can break that the wheel going into the hamster going into the wheel, as you had described, sort of going back to the same situation with where Israel, there's no impunity, and you have, international bodies or international community allowing Israel to continue with a genocide. On the other hand, we see, a shift definitely in the streets of many of these countries in the West that have pushed for some of these changes, and they're going to see through this plan as well. And I think the hope is that these efforts will continue, and they will continue to make the change that is needed. Whether we're talking about sanctions, we're seeing some movements in those directions, but they're not being translated in the larger schemes that we're seeing today.
Yes.
However, we're seeing them in smaller ways. I mean, I'm in the UK, and about an hour ago, the Labour Party had their annual meeting, and members of the Labour Party acknowledged that a genocide used the term genocide to describe what's happening in Gaza. Of course, it
Did
does not
Starmer have a
change anything.
seizure?
Yeah, but Starmer of course, has not changed his language. But I mean, it's we're seeing some changes. Now, how do will they be translated somehow? Uh, so that we don't see these boards of peace that don't really represent peace, or a plan that does not lead to liberation and
Yeah.
an end of subjugation.
Well, that's the key distinction here. On the one hand, you have these kinds of absurd, uh, meaningless, unattainable proposals like this 21 now 20-point plan, which is very much the work of governments, elites, the usual suspects who have destroyed Iraq, who have destroyed Libya, who have directly participated in the destruction of Syria, who have been involved basically in fomenting insecurity and instability throughout the region, and those are the governments and the elites and so on. But against that, you have this growing tide of public opinion, of organizations and movements and so on. And just to get back to the earlier part of our discussion, it's there that I think one needs to understand the real significance of this recent wave of recognitions. Significance is not that, a government in Paris or London or, in some of these other countries extended formal recognition to the state of Palestine. The significance is that the recognition of Palestinian statehood marks the first time since the emergence of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century that Western governments have taken measures in support of the Palestinian people, not in order to maintain ties with Arab governments, not out of exasperation with Israeli conduct, but in response to public pressure from their own citizens. That has
Mm,
really never happened
mm,
before. And so rather than dismiss this as meaningless, it's time to build on it and to recognize that, yes, these governments are susceptible to pressure. It's going to be perhaps much more difficult because, the schism between ruler and ruled in many Western societies is much greater than it was in decades past.
yeah,
But it shows that pressure can work, and it shows that greater pressure can even change policy, and that is, I think, why Israel and its apologists are having such a meltdown over recognitions. Not so much because of the acts of recognition, but because of the context in which they were taken, the reasons for which they were taken, and the fear that the dam is bursting and can be followed by more meaningful changes in policy. I was recently invited to participate in a webinar in Slovenia, and Slovenia, as you know,
mhm,
has been one of the most energetic European states in terms of
yeah,
speaking up for Palestinian rights. And I think it was recently the first country that formally banned the international fugitive,
mhm.
Benjamin Netanyahu,
Netanyahu.
from
Mhm,
entering its territory. And after the recording, I asked my host, Slovenia is a small and weak member of the European Union. How has it been able to play such an important role? And the response I was given, again, I know nothing about Slovenian politics. I'm only repeating to you what I was told, is that the government that is currently in power in Slovenia came there as a result of the activism of civil society, of labor
wow,
unions and other groups and so on, and understands that it's very dependent on them to remain
mm,
in power, and is therefore much more responsive to public opinion than was its predecessor, or as are many other governments in Europe. And this, again, I think is a very hopeful sign
mm,
because, again, in contrast to previous eras, it shows that where governments are responsive to public opinion, rather than to party elites or funders and so on the Middle East. The direction of travel is increasingly in support of Palestinian rights.
Yeah, yeah, no, it is a very encouraging sign. I wanted to get your take on sort of other plans or during the UN, the Colombian president called for Uniting for Peace proposal. Um, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and what you think about that gaining any momentum.
Yeah. So I'm not particularly familiar with it, but my understanding is as the Colombian president Petro is
Yeah,
basically proposing that the United Nations General Assembly, because of the inability of the Security Council to address anything concerning Israel, thanks to the guarantee of a U.S. veto, is proposing that the General Assembly adopt a resolution under the Uniting for Peace mechanism, under which it would formulate or make a peacekeeping force and send it to the Gaza Strip as a kind of international armed intervention, if I understood it correctly,
yeah,
to stop the genocide. It's obviously any such proposal has my full and unqualified support. But having said that, I think we can safely conclude that it's a fool's errand to have any confidence in the international community as formally constituted, including the United Nations General Assembly, to be able to act effectively. I think the proposal would need the consent of two-thirds of the members of the General Assembly. I don't see that happening. What I
mm,
personally would find much more effective, and again, it's a long shot, I don't see it happening tomorrow morning, is that you get these coalitions of the willing, if you will, like the Hague Group, which is doing
yes,
fantastic work, where you have a group of governments that are committed to upholding international law and human rights, that have a clear position of opposing genocide rather than supporting and celebrating it, and that are willing to take action. And strangely enough, we're beginning to see uh, this in action with the Sumud Flotilla, the latest flotilla to set sail for Gaza, which is now being escorted
hmm,
by Spanish and Italian warships. The Italians, very much for reasons than their own, rather than out of any support for Palestinian rights. But I think when governments act independently of these international institutions, at least it's my impression, there's a much greater likelihood that they can actually do something effective to uphold and enforce international law and basic principles of human rights.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we the Sumud Flotilla is due to arrive on Thursday. If
On the 30th, yes.
yeah, yeah, if all proceeds well, or maybe earlier. It feels like every day there are developments,
Yeah.
and some are hopeful. Today's announcement is um, puzzling, maybe unclear, but I think you gave us enough to be cautious about and also wary of. Maybe and you probably use much stronger language than that. Definitely.
I'll leave it at that. I will just say one more thing. The latest development, as far as the flotilla is concerned, is that Israel has assembled its own renta mob and is sending them out a flotilla of its own, of course, with Israeli flags and, genocidal chants and so on, to try to block this flotilla, because unlike the case of the Mavi Marmara, it can't just land commandos on these ships and put a bullet through the heads of 10 of the participants. Again, because several governments now either feel that it's the right thing to do or that they have no other choice but to seek to take the edge off Israel's increasingly brazen conduct
Yeah.
and total impunity.
And to protect their citizens who are
Yeah,
on the boats.
of
I
course,
mean,
that too.
I
Yeah.
think there's that pressure. There's
Mm.
um and the mounting pressure of people on the streets, which I think
Yes.
obviously we are seeing the results of that. We often feel like, all these protests and nothing, and of course it takes a lot more than what we are seeing now. But we are seeing that there is power behind that voice. And so if there's any encouragement or silver lining in all of this, I guess it would be that, at least for me, to take hope in that. And of course, the genocide continues. We have to continue to work every day, every minute to end this genocide. And until it ends, we will continue this work.
Yeah, it's it's a race against time as people become increasingly engaged and as people place increasing pressure on their leaders. The results are not immediate, and
Yeah,
tens of thousands, overwhelmingly civilians, have already died. And with
yeah,
every passing day, not only are additional numbers dying, but now you also have famine, and tens of thousands are being put at risk. And the other point that I would make is that if the guns do fall silent, uh, that's not when our work ends,
yeah.
because what will still need to be saved and what will need to be repaired and what will need to be made whole and what will
Mm,
need to be salvaged and what will need to be achieved for a meaningful future is a challenge at least as great, at least as important, and at least as meaningful as ending this daily slaughter of men, women, and children throughout the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, perhaps once again in Iran, and who knows where else. This genocidal apartheid regime, this rogue state, um, uh, needs to be stopped. Impunity needs to be replaced by accountability, and I think it's clear as daylight. It's never going to come from governments unless they're left with no other choice.
yeah. Very well put. Thank you, Maureen. I was lost for words there, and as always, I learned so much from you.
Thank you very
And
much,
and I
Hilary.
know that, this is just the beginning of a conversation that will continue in many more interviews you will be having, and in your writings we'll all be following
Thank you.
what you'll be sharing in the next few days. But I'm so appreciative of you taking the time today to share your thoughts with us. And with this, I want to also thank our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other rich content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast and stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. And you can also watch video versions of our podcast, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I am Hilary Rantisi, signing off until the next episode
It was
of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts.
it was a real
Bye.
pleasure, Hilary, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.